There is a word, and I use it here not to be decorative, not to reach for the exotic flavor of a foreign tongue, but because it is genuinely the most precise word available for what I am trying to describe. The word is missing. It means, approximately, a longing for something you have lost, or something you never had, or something that exists in a space between memory and imagination where the distinction between the two has become unclear. It is the feeling of missing something that is not gone, but that you have suddenly, acutely, understood could be. Daniel did not know this word, but he felt the thing it describes. Sitting on that bus in the second row, left side, aisle, watching the city scroll past with the new and slightly unsteady vision of someone whose eyes have been adjusted without their consent. He felt it for the tree he had watched go gold. He felt it for the alley outside his office window and the 11 minutes of morning light. He felt it with a particular and unexpected force. For people he had not thought about in weeks, his mother, a friend from college he had been meaning to call, a woman he had dated briefly 2 years ago who had once made him laugh so hard he had to sit down, whose face he could still recall with perfect clarity, even though her phone number had long since been replaced by someone else's in his contacts. He felt it for versions of his own life he had not yet lived. This is what almost does to a person if they let it. If they do not immediately reach for the mechanism of numbing, the phone, the music, the deliberate forward thrust of I'm fine. It didn't happen, move on, and instead stay with the weight of the thing. Let it press against them the way something heavy presses, not to crush but to make itself known. Almost opens a door you did not know was there. And through that door, if you are willing to look, is a view of your own life from the outside, the particular, vertiginous perspective of seeing your existence, not as the fixed and given thing it feels like from inside it, but as one of many possible outcomes. One thread in a fabric that could have been woven differently, that almost was, that on a different morning with a different alarm setting would have been. This is not a comfortable view, but it is an honest one. He got to the office 40 minutes late. His colleague Marcus looked up from his desk with the mild, unsurprised expression of a man who had learned long ago that mornings were unreliable and had made his peace with this. Marcus was the kind of person who moved through the world with a steadiness that Daniel had always admired without ever quite being able to explain. The steadiness of someone whose center of gravity was located somewhere very deep, somewhere below the reach of traffic and delayed buses and urgently non-urgent emails. You hear about the Route 14 thing? Marcus said. Not as a question exactly. More as an opening, the offering of a known thing to see what the other person does with it. Daniel set his bag down. He sat in his chair. He looked at his desk, the stacked papers, the coffee mug with a ring dried into the bottom that he kept meaning to wash, the small framed photo of him and his mother taken at her birthday 3 years ago, both of them squinting against the sun in the backyard of her house in a different city, both of them laughing at something that the camera had captured the aftermath of, but not the cause. I was supposed to be on it, he said. Marcus went quiet in the way people go quiet when something lands differently than they expected. Not dramatically. Just a pause. A recalibration. The brief suspension of the ordinary flow of things while a new piece of information finds its place. But you weren't, Marcus said finally. No, Daniel said. I wasn't. There was a moment between them that was not quite a conversation and not quite silence. The kind of moment that happens between people who know each other well enough to understand that some things do not need to be unpacked immediately. That some things can be acknowledged with a look and a pause and the shared understanding that what was almost lost and what was not lost are both real, simultaneously, and that the space between them is where the actual weight of the morning lives. Marcus nodded once. He turned back to his screen. He said, very quietly, without looking up, "Glad you were late." Daniel looked at the framed photo. His mother, squinting in the sun, laughing at something he could no longer remember. He thought about Sunday phone calls. He thought about the question she always asked, disguised as practical concern, which was actually the most important question anyone had ever asked him with any regularity. He picked up his phone and he called her. Not Sunday. Tuesday morning. 40 minutes late to a desk in a logistics company in a city that did not care about him. Calling his mother because the alternative, the version of this morning in which he did not call, in which he absorbed the near miss quietly and moved on and filed it under things that didn't happen, felt suddenly and completely like the wrong choice. Like the waste of something that had been given to him at a cost he would never fully know how to calculate. She answered on the second ring, the way she always answered, with a slight breathlessness, as if she had crossed a room quickly to reach the phone, as if the possibility that it might stop ringing before she got there was a risk she was not willing to take. "Daniel, is everything okay?" And he said, "Yeah, Mom, everything's fine. I wanted to hear your voice." A pause. Brief, warm. The specific warmth of a pause that contains recognition, the recognition of being needed in a particular way at a particular moment, which is one of the things love most often asks us to be available for. "Well," she said, and he could hear the smile in it. That particular vocal shape that her smile made, that he had known his entire life. "I'm glad you called." He spent the rest of the morning doing the things he always did. He answered emails. He managed spreadsheets. He coordinated shipments. He sat at his desk by the window and waited for the light to come in at the right angle and turn the alley gold. And when it did, he watched it for the full 11 minutes without looking away, without reaching for his phone, without letting the reflex of productivity interrupt the simpler and more important act of being present for something beautiful that was happening right now. In the narrow alley outside his window for free. For no reason except that it always did, and he had never before thought to protect it with his full attention. But underneath all of this, underneath the ordinary machinery of the day running as it always ran, something else was running too. A quieter process. The kind of processing that does not announce itself, that happens in the background of consciousness, the way the body processes food, converting raw material into something the self can use. He was thinking about almost, not obsessively. Not in the way trauma circles, returning to the same ground repeatedly with the same desperate urgency. More the way you think about something that has genuinely changed the angle of your perspective, returning to it not with fear but with the specific hunger of a person who has been handed a lens they did not have before and wants to understand what else it shows them. What did almost mean? Not in the abstract, not philosophically, personally. What did it mean for him, specifically in his specific life? With his specific desk and his specific window, and his specific habit of letting the important calls wait until Sunday, and his specific tendency to move through mornings on autopilot. Efficient and present, and genuinely, almost completely not there. He had a conversation with himself that afternoon that he would not have been able to have 6 hours earlier. Not because he lacked the intelligence for it, but because intelligence is not the relevant variable. The relevant variable is attention, and attention requires a reason to sharpen itself. And the reasons we are given are not always the reasons we would choose. Sometimes the reason arrives wrapped in inconvenience. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in a notification from a news app you barely use, read on a sidewalk in the cold, 12 minutes into a wait you resented. He asked himself the question that the morning had, in its strange and indirect way, been building toward since the alarm went off at 6:47 instead of 6:41. What am I not paying attention to? Not a dramatic question. Not the kind of question that changes a life in a single sitting, that resolves into a clean answer and a clear action and a story you can tell later with a satisfying arc. The honest version of this question is messier than that. The honest version opens into more questions, each one quieter and more personal than the last. Each one pointing somewhere he had been not quite looking. In the way we are often not quite looking at the things that matter most, because they do not demand our attention. The way urgent things do, because they are patient and permanent seeming. Because we have assigned them the status of guaranteed when nothing, as it turns out, has ever been guaranteed. The calls he did not make. The conversations he had been meaning to have. The friend from college whose messages he answered with the reliable half-presence of someone who intends to be more available soon. Always soon, in a future that keeps rescheduling itself further ahead. The life that was happening in the margins of the life he was managing in the 11 minutes of gold light. In the gargoyle on the building across from the bus stop. In the child with the stick investigating the crack in the sidewalk. In the man with the notebook absorbing the world with such complete and uncomplicated openness that Daniel had felt. Watching him, a kind of longing he could not immediately name. He wrote some of this down. Not carefully. not in the organized, legible way of someone who journals with intention. In the back of a meeting notebook, in the margins, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than usual, as if the content was moving faster than the hand could manage. Not sentences. Mostly, fragments, names, questions with no question marks because the marks seemed too small for what he was asking. He wrote his mother's name. He wrote the word tree. He wrote, third row right side window, and then he sat for a moment, looking at those 5 words and what they contained, and he did not write anything else for a while. By the time he left the office that evening, the day had resumed its ordinary texture. The commute home was unremarkable. He made dinner, actually made it, not the assembled from components version he usually defaulted to on weekdays, but something that required a cutting board and a pan and the specific, grounding attention of a person using their hands to make something real. He ate it at the table instead of the couch. He did not have the television on. He sat in the quiet of his apartment and he ate. And he looked at the wall, and the wall did not offer anything particular, but he looked at it anyway, because looking was something he was practicing now, even if he could not have articulated the practice in any formal way. He thought about the route the 743 had taken, the different streets, the different windows, the tree he had watched go fully gold on a block he passed every morning without ever having seen it, become what it had become overnight. He thought about Route 14 and the overpass and the guardrail and the frost and the fractures and all the small, invisible accumulations of circumstance that had been building toward that moment for months, in maintenance reports and metal and cold air, without anyone knowing, without any announcement. He thought about his own small invisible accumulations, the ones that had been building in him in the margins of his managed life, quietly requesting attention he had not yet found a way to give. And he thought, not for the last time, but for the first time with this particular clarity, about what it means to almost lose something you did not know you were taking for granted. Not the dramatic things. Not the large name things we know to hold carefully because their value is obvious and their loss is unthinkable. The small things. The ordinary things. The Tuesday morning things. The things that are just there, every day, patient and present and waiting, the way a tree waits, the way light waits, the way the people who love us wait, for the moment when we are finally still enough, finally stopped enough, finally forced by circumstance or alarm clock or missed bus to actually be where we are and see what is there. Here is the question that arrives, eventually, for everyone who has lived through a moment like Daniel's. Not immediately. Not on the bus ride home or over dinner or in the quiet of the apartment with the television off. It arrives later in the days that follow, when the acute edge of the experience has softened enough that the mind can stop simply feeling it and start examining it. It arrives the way serious questions always arrive, not with fanfare. Not announced, but quietly in the space between sleeping and waking. Or in the middle of a task so automatic that the deeper part of the mind has been left unoccupied and has filled the vacancy with something it has been turning over without permission. The question is this: was it meant to happen? 4 words. Simple enough to fit on the back of a receipt. Complicated enough to have occupied philosophers and theologians and ordinary people lying awake at 3 a.m. for as long as human beings have been capable of lying, awake and asking questions about the shape of their own lives. Was it meant to happen? Was there a plan? Was there an intelligence behind the sequence of small events, the alarm, the neighbor, the recycling bins, the 4 minutes, the missed bus, or was it simply chaos? Simply the blind accumulation of unrelated causes, producing an outcome that only looks like intention in retrospect. The way clouds only look like faces if you are already inclined to see faces in things? This is not a question I can answer for you. I want to be honest about that because the alternative, the clean, satisfying answer that resolves the tension and sends you away feeling certain about the architecture of the universe, would be a lie dressed up as comfort. And comfort purchased with dishonesty has a very short shelf life. It feels good for exactly as long as it takes for the next hard morning to arrive, and then it dissolves. And you are left with the original question, plus the additional weight of having believed something that couldn't hold. So I will not tell you the universe has a plan, and I will not tell you it doesn't. What I will do is sit with you in the honest middle of the question, where most of us actually live, and look at what is there. Daniel thought about this for weeks. He was not, by nature, a person given to extended philosophical reflection. He was practical. He was organized. He was the kind of person who made lists and worked through them and found satisfaction in the completion of things, in the tangible evidence of effort converted into outcome. Metaphysics was not his native territory. He had taken one philosophy course in college, retained a general impression of it as important and difficult and not immediately applicable, and had moved on. But this question would not be moved on from. It kept returning. In the shower. On the bus, Route 14 was running again within a week. New guardrail, and Daniel had gotten back on it. Because not getting back on it would have been a different kind of surrender. And he had decided he was not interested in that kind of surrender. He rode it in a different seat now. Not permanently. Not out of superstition. Just because the experience of sitting somewhere new had shown him that there were other views available and he was interested in them. He sat in different seats, and the question rode with him, patient and persistent, and not especially interested in his schedule. Was it meant to happen? He approached it the way he approached problems at work, from multiple angles. Testing each one for structural integrity. Looking for the place where it held and the place where it didn't. The case for meaning is seductive, and it is not stupid. It goes like this: look at the sequence of events. The alarm set 6 minutes late. Not 10, not 2, but 6. The exact number needed to create a deficit that could not be recovered without either skipping Mrs. Carrasco entirely, which was not in Daniel's character, or missing the bus, which is what happened. Mrs. Carrasco herself. Why that morning? She had lived in that building for 11 years. She had managed her recycling for 11 years without requiring assistance on a Tuesday at 7:19 in the morning. Why that morning, of all mornings, did she emerge from the side entrance at exactly the moment Daniel was passing it, with exactly enough bags to need exactly enough help to cost exactly the minutes required? And the frost in the fractures of a guardrail that had been compromised for 8 months without failing, that had survived rain and wind and the daily drift of a delivery truck, that chose this particular morning, this Tuesday, this route, this bus, to give way under the specific combination of temperature and pressure and the accumulated weight of time. If you arrange these facts in a line and look at them together, they have the appearance of intention. They look, if you are willing to look at them that way, like a sequence of small interventions, each one modest and deniable on its own. Each one pointing in the same direction, all of them together adding up to something that feels less like accident and more like arrangement. This is the case for meaning. It is not nothing. But here is the case against, and it deserves equal honesty. The overpass above Kellner Avenue did not choose its Tuesday. The frost does not consult a calendar. The delivery truck driver did not drift left for Daniel's benefit. These were physical events obeying physical laws, metal weakened by stress, ice formed by temperature, a vehicle following a path worn into its driver's muscle memory by repetition. They were not aimed at anyone. They were not arranged for anyone. They were the universe doing what the universe does. Which is to say, everything simultaneously, without narrative, without the connective tissue of meaning. Just a vast and impersonal machinery of cause producing effect, producing cause, on and on, in every direction, without rest and without intention and without any particular interest in the small dramas of the individual lives it moves through. And Daniel's delay, the alarm, Mrs. Carrasco, the recycling bins, these two were just causes producing effects. An integer entered wrong in the dark. A neighbor with ordinary needs and ordinary timing. A city redesigning its recycling infrastructure, according to an efficiency protocol that had nothing to do with anyone's survival. None of it was for Daniel. All of it simply was, and Daniel happened to be in its path, and the outcome happened to be the outcome it was. This is the case against meaning. It is also not nothing. And here is where Daniel arrived. After weeks of riding buses and new seats and writing fragments and meeting notebooks and calling his mother on days that were not Sunday and sitting with the question that would not be moved on from, he arrived at the possibility that both things are true, not as a compromise, not as the intellectual equivalent of splitting the difference because you lack the courage to commit to either side, as an actual position arrived at through actual thought that holds within it a genuine and livable truth. The universe may be indifferent. and what happens within it may still matter enormously. These two things are not mutually exclusive. An indifferent universe does not produce meaningless lives. Meaning is not something the cosmos distributes from above, handed down in the form of arranged coincidences and protected bus passengers. Meaning is something that happens in the encounter between a human consciousness and the events it moves through it is made. Not given, assembled from the raw material of experience by the part of us that insists on coherence. That cannot help but look for the pattern that wakes up after a near miss on an overpass and asks, with genuine urgency, what this is supposed to tell me. The asking is not delusion. The asking is the most human thing there is. What Daniel understood, sitting in a seat he had never sat in before, watching a city he had watched 100 times with eyes that had been adjusted by a Tuesday morning in autumn, was that the question of whether the universe intended his delay was less important, finally, practically, in terms of how he was going to live his life, than the question of what he was going to do with it. Whether the alarm was fate or accident, he had still been standing on the sidewalk. Whether Mrs. Carrasco's timing was arranged or coincidental, he had still chosen to stop. Whether the frost in the guardrail was providence or physics, he had still been given a morning that could have ended differently and didn't. And the life waiting on the other side of that morning, the calls unmade, the conversations deferred, the tree going gold on the block he passed without seeing, the 11 minutes of light he had been living inside without fully inhabiting, that life was his to do something with, regardless of who or what or whether anything had arranged for him to still be in it. This is where destiny and choice stop being opposites. This is where the question of was it meant to happen gives way to the more actionable and more honest question of, what do I do now that it has? He thought about the people he knew who had lived through their own versions of this. Not always bus accidents. Not always near misses in the physical sense. But the other kinds of almost, the diagnosis that came early enough. The conversation that happened before it was too late. The door that closed and the one that opened just after. The morning that started wrong and became the hinge on which something important turned. He thought about what those people had done with their almosts. Some of them had been changed permanently, visibly, in the dramatic ways that make for clean narratives. They had quit jobs, ended relationships, moved cities, made the leap they had been standing at the edge of for years. Some of them had been changed in ways that were invisible from the outside but profound from within. Quieter presences. Better listeners, people who had learned to sit still in ways they could not have managed before. And some of them had not been changed at all. Some of them had felt the vertigo of almost and then closed the door on it quickly, efficiently. With the determined forward motion of people who have decided that the safest response to being reminded of your own mortality is to behave as if the reminder never came. He understood this. He did not judge it. The reminder is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is real, and the desire to return to the familiar territory of the unexamined. Life is not weakness. It is a very human form of self-protection. But he had decided, somewhere between the sidewalk and the bus and the gold tree and the phone call with his mother and the dinner, made on a cutting board on a Tuesday night, that he was not going to close that door. Not because he had become someone different, because he had, for the first time in a long time, seen clearly who he already was, and what that person was capable of, and what that person was in danger of wasting, and what that person owed to the version of this morning that had almost happened instead. There is a concept in physics, and I raise it not as metaphor but as fact, because sometimes the facts of the physical world are the most poetic things available, called the butterfly effect. The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can, through an unbroken chain of atmospheric cause and effect, influence the formation of a storm somewhere else entirely. The idea that small initial differences propagated through complex systems produce outcomes wildly disproportionate to their origins. That 6 minutes in the right system at the right moment with the right constellation of variables can mean everything. Daniel had been 6 minutes late. He turned this over in his hands the way you turn over a stone you have found somewhere unexpected, not precious, not dramatic, just small and real and heavier than it looks. 6 minutes. The entire distance between the life he was living and the life that had almost not continued. He did not find this terrifying. He found it, after everything, clarifying. If 6 minutes could do that, then any 6 minutes could matter. Any delay, any detour, any moment of forced stillness in a life that preferred motion, any of these could be, in the right circumstances, the 6 minutes. The ones that hold everything. The ones that the rest of it turns on without your knowledge or consent. And if that was true, and he had decided it was, not as theology, but as lived experience, not as belief, but as the thing that had actually happened to him on a Tuesday morning when his alarm went off wrong, then the only reasonable response was to pay attention. To all of it. To the ordinary texture of the life happening around him and inside him, in the margins of the managed day. In the 11 minutes of light and the cracks in the sidewalk and the trees going gold when you are not looking. And the people who love you and answer on the second ring and have a smile you can hear through the phone. To pay attention, not because everything was fragile, but because everything was real. The weeks after a moment like Daniel's do not announce themselves as significant. This is the part of the story that does not make it into the versions people tell at dinner parties or into the brief, luminous social media posts that compress transformation into a caption and a photograph of something golden. The weeks after are not cinematic. They do not have a score. They look, from the outside, almost identical to the weeks before. Same desk, same window, same bus, same city doing what cities do with the magnificent indifference of something that has been doing it longer than anyone alive can remember. But inside them, something is different. Not everything. Not dramatically. Not in the way we are sometimes promised transformation works. The clean before and after, the person who walked into the fire and walked out, changed in every particular. Daniel was still Daniel. He still set his alarm wrong occasionally. He still ate granola bars on the way to the bus stop sometimes when the morning did not cooperate. He still had days when the emails felt endless and the spreadsheets felt meaningless, and the light did not come in at the right angle. And the alley outside his window was just an alley. But there were things that had shifted. Small things, mostly. The kind of things that would not show up in any external accounting of a life, but that constitute, in their accumulation, the actual texture of being alive. The difference between a life being lived and a life being managed. The difference between presence and procedure. He called his mother more. Not every day. That would have alarmed her, frankly. And raised questions he was not sure how to answer without telling a story he was still in the middle of understanding. But more than Sundays. Wednesdays sometimes. A Thursday once, just because something had happened at work that was mildly funny and he had found himself wanting to tell her about it immediately rather than filing it away for the weekend summary. She always answered quickly. She always had the smile in her voice. She always asked, eventually, how he was eating, and he always told her, and neither of them said directly what the calls were actually about, which was everything. He began to notice the tree. Not just the gold tree on the block he passed every morning, though he noticed that one too. Watched it shed its color over the following weeks with the unhurried generosity of something that has done this before and knows the cycle. Knows that the bare branches are not an ending, but a different kind of beauty. Knows that the whole performance will begin again. He noticed trees generally. The specific way each one occupied its space. The particular quality of their stillness. The way they existed in the middle of everything the city did around them with a patience so complete it almost looked like wisdom. He had walked past hundreds of trees for years without seeing them as anything other than the vague category of nature encountered in urban environments. Now he saw them as individuals, as presences, as things that had been there before him and would be there after and were doing something genuine in the meantime. This sounds small. It was not small. He reached out to the friend from college. His name was Patrick, and they had been close. In the way people are close at 22, the closeness of shared geography and shared confusion and the particular intimacy of figuring out who you are in proximity to someone else who is figuring out the same thing. They had drifted in the way people drift, not with any argument or rupture. Just the slow gravitational pull of separate lives moving in separate directions. Maintained by occasional messages and the mutual understanding that the friendship still existed even in its dormancy. That it was still there in the way things are still there when you are not looking at them. Daniel sent him a message on a Wednesday evening. Sitting at his kitchen table after a dinner made on a cutting board. With the quiet around him that he had learned, in the weeks since the overpass, to inhabit instead of fill. The message was not dramatic. He did not explain what had happened. He did not preface it with, "You'll never believe what I almost," or "I've been thinking about this since." He just said, "Hey, been a while. I've been thinking about you. How are you actually doing?" 3 questions. 43 characters. The kind of message that takes 30 seconds to write and can sit in a draft folder for months. Because the moment never quite feels right. Because there is always something else demanding the attention. Because reaching towards something you have let lapse requires admitting that you let it lapse. And that admission, however small, costs something. Patrick responded within the hour. "Man, I was literally thinking about you last week. Where did the time go?" And then they were talking, actually talking. Not the performative exchange of updates that passes for conversation between people who have lost the habit of the real thing. But talking the way they used to talk at 22. With the roughness and the humor and the willingness to say things that were true even when they were uncomfortable. Even when they required some sitting with before they resolved into anything useful. They talked for 2 hours. They made plans that they actually kept. Patrick came to visit the following month, and they stayed up too late and talked about things neither of them had said to anyone else, and Daniel made breakfast the next morning, actual breakfast. On a cutting board with a pan, and they ate it at the table and the light came in at an angle. That was not the alley outside his office window, but was its own kind of gold. Domestic and specific and entirely sufficient. These things happened because Daniel had sent a message on a Wednesday evening. The message happened because he had been thinking about Patrick for weeks. He had been thinking about Patrick because he had sat in a quiet apartment after a near miss on a Tuesday morning and asked himself what he was not paying attention to. And Patrick's name had surfaced in the honest answer. All of it flowing from the alarm set 6 minutes wrong. The butterfly effect, quiet and domestic and real. There is something that happens when one person decides to pay attention. It is not private. It does not stay contained within the life of the person who decided. It moves the way warmth moves, not announcing itself. Not making claims, just shifting the temperature of the immediate environment in ways that register differently by different people but register nonetheless. Daniel's colleagues noticed something, though none of them would have been able to articulate it precisely if asked. He was more present in meetings, not more vocal. Not more performatively engaged, but actually there, actually listening. His eyes on the speaker with the quality of attention that communicates something beyond mere politeness. A junior colleague named Sophia, who had joined the company 6 months earlier and was still in the careful, watchful phase of a new job, said something to Marcus one afternoon that Marcus later mentioned to Daniel. Not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation. "Your friend Daniel actually looks at you when you're talking. Like he's actually listening. It's kind of unusual." Marcus had laughed. He had said, yeah, he had a thing happen to him. Made him different somehow. Different. Daniel turned this word over when Marcus told him. He was not sure it was the right word. He did not feel different in any fundamental sense. He felt more like himself. If anything, more like the version of himself that existed in the photograph his friend had taken at the party. The one where he was reading something off a bookshelf with complete absorption. His face quiet and removed and entirely his own. Less like the version that moved through mornings on autopilot, efficient and present, and almost completely not there. Not different, more of what had always been there. Given room to exist by the experience of almost losing the opportunity for it to exist at all. He went back to the bus stop on Meridian Street on a Saturday. Not for any particular reason. Not as ritual, not as pilgrimage, not to mark the moment with ceremony it had not asked for. He was in the neighborhood running errands. And he found himself turning down the familiar street and approaching the familiar corner and standing at the familiar stop with the particular feeling of a person returning to a place that looks exactly as it did before. Everything changed and finding, in that unchangedness, something that is the opposite of disappointment. The gargoyle was still there, worn by decades of rain and city air into its ambiguous expression, not quite scowling, not quite grinning, or perhaps both at once, depending on the light and the angle and the disposition of the person looking at it. Daniel stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. Long enough that a woman walking past glanced up to see what he was looking at, found the gargoyle, seemed briefly uncertain whether this was something she should also be looking at, and walked on. He thought about the day he had first really seen it. Standing in the cold with his granola bar and his irritation and his absolutely ordinary, justifiable fury at a morning that had not cooperated. Standing there without knowing what the not cooperating was doing for him. Without knowing about the frost or the guardrail or the 40 feet of air between the right side of Route 14 and the street below. He had been standing exactly where he needed to be. He had not known. He had not been able to know. And this, finally, was the thing he had been working his way toward through all the weeks of bus rides and notebook margins and Wednesday phone calls and dinners made on cutting boards and long conversations with Patrick that went until both of them were tired and satisfied in the way you are satisfied after doing something real. The not knowing is not the problem. We are never going to know in the moment, which delays our protection and which are just delays. We are never going to know which wrong turns are detours and which are just wrong turns. We are never going to have the perspective in the middle of the inconvenience that we have in the aftermath of it. When the full shape of what almost happened or what instead happened becomes visible in a way, it could not have been while we were still inside it. The not knowing is not the problem. The not paying attention is? He thought about all the people who had been on Route 14 that morning. The ones he had never met, whose names he did not know. Who had been sitting in their seats. First row, fifth row, left side, right side, window, aisle. When the truck drifted and the frost did its work, and the morning became something other than a morning. He thought about them with a specific, sober tenderness, not with guilt. He had worked through the complicated feelings around the fact of his absence. The uneasy flavor of relief that comes tangled with concern for those who were not as absent, but with the tenderness of someone who understands. Now, that on any given Tuesday, the distance between your story and someone else's is thinner than you think. And that this thinness is not cause for paralysis, but for the specific, grounded appreciation of what you have while you have it. Some of those passengers had been injured. Some had walked away. All of them had been changed by what happened in a different way than Daniel had been changed by what almost happened. And he was aware that his version, the clean version, the version where you get to stand on a sidewalk and feel the near miss from a safe distance, was a particular kind of luck that not everyone had been given that morning, and that this particular luck carried with it something that felt, if he was honest, like responsibility. Not the crushing, paralyzing kind of responsibility that tells you your life must now be a monument to the moment you were spared. The quieter kind. The kind that says, pay attention, make the calls, notice the trees, eat breakfast at the table, sit in different seats, look at the gargoyle, answer the question your colleague is asking you with your full presence rather than the part of you that is already composing the response, while they are still in the middle of the asking. The kind that says, you are here, act like it. Standing at the bus stop on that Saturday, with no bus expected and no errands requiring urgency and the city doing its weekend thing around him, slower, slightly softer at the edges. The particular quality of a city that has given itself partial permission to rest. Daniel felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since the morning of the alarm and the neighbor and the notification. Not resolution, exactly. The question of destiny versus choice was not resolved. It was not going to be resolved. It was the kind of question that a person lives with rather than answers that becomes, over time, less a source of anxiety and more a source of a particular kind of orientation, a compass that does not point to a destination, but that keeps you honest about the direction you are facing. What settled was something simpler. The understanding that he was grateful, not in the performed, public way of gratitude as virtue signaling, not in the anxious way of gratitude as defense against future loss, not in the superstitious way of gratitude as a down payment on continued good fortune, just the plain quiet, unadorned feeling of a person who has been given something and knows it and is not pretending otherwise. He was grateful for the 6 minutes. He was grateful for the alarm set wrong and the neighbor with the recycling bins and the 4 minutes of conversation about the elevator and the cold sidewalk and the 20 minutes that had felt like punishment and turned out to be something else entirely. He was grateful for the inconvenience. And standing there, looking at the gargoyle with its ambiguous stone face, on a Saturday with no bus coming and no particular place he needed to be, He understood something that he suspected. He would spend the rest of his life finding new ways to understand. That gratitude for the inconvenience is not naive. It is not the soft, uncritical thinking of a person who has decided that everything happens for a reason and left it there. It is something harder than that and more honest. It is the willingness to sit with the fact that you cannot know, in the middle of the delay, what the delay is for. It is the willingness to hold your frustration lightly enough that it does not become a wall between you and what the moment might actually be offering. It is the practice, and it is a practice. It requires repetition and imperfection and the humility to begin again every time you forget, of treating the interruptions in your life, not as obstacles to your life, but as part of it. Not every interruption is an overpass and a guardrail and a frost. Most of them are just interruptions. But you do not get to know which is which. And so you pay attention to all of them. I want to ask you something. Not a rhetorical question. Not the kind of question that is really a statement in disguise, dressed up with a question mark to seem more collaborative than it is. A real question, the kind that deserves a real answer. The kind you give not out loud but in the quiet of your own mind. In the space between reading this and putting it down. In the moment when the story is still warm in you and the distance. Between Daniel's sidewalk and your own life is smaller than it usually is. What is irritating you right now? Not the large things. Not the grief or the fear or the named and serious difficulties that we all carry and that deserve their own kind of attention, their own kind of care. I mean the smaller things. The daily friction. The alarm that goes off wrong. The bus that leaves without you. The neighbor who needs 4 minutes you did not plan to give. The elevator that is broken for the 3rd week in a row. The email that requires a response you do not have the energy to compose. The morning that adds up to slightly less than you needed it to be. What is in that category for you, right now, today? Because I want to suggest something. Not as certainty I have tried throughout this story. To be honest about what cannot be known with certainty. And I'm not going to abandon that honesty in the final minutes because a clean conclusion would be more satisfying. But as possibility, as the kind of thing worth sitting with, even if you ultimately decide it does not apply. Even if you ultimately file it under interesting idea. Not for me. Moving on. What if the thing that is irritating you is not evidence that the universe is indifferent to your schedule? What if it is a pause? Daniel's story did not end on the sidewalk on Meridian Street. Stories never end where they appear to end. They continue in the person who lived them, in the adjustments of perception that accumulate slowly and change the angle of everything. In the calls made on Wednesdays, in the breakfasts eaten at tables. In the trees noticed on blocks walked 100 times without looking. They continue in the people touched by the person who has changed, Marcus. Who noticed something different and mentioned it to Sophia. Who felt seen in a meeting and stayed at the company another year and eventually became the kind of colleague who made the whole floor slightly warmer. In the specific way that one person paying real attention can shift the temperature of a shared space. They continue in Patrick, who came to visit and stayed up too late and went home and called his own mother the next morning. Not because Daniel had told him to, but because something about the weekend had loosened something in him that had been held too tight for too long. They continue in Mrs. Carrasco, who did not know any of this. Who went about her life with her recycling bins and her pinned white hair and her opinions about the elevator. Completely unaware that 4 minutes of her Tuesday morning had become a weight-bearing wall in someone else's story. They continue in you. Because here's the thing about stories like this, and I mean this not as flattery, not as the writer's trick of making the reader feel included to generate warmth, but as something I genuinely believe to be true about the way stories work and why we tell them and why. After thousands of years of human beings sitting together and passing narratives between them like food, we have not stopped. Stories continue in the people who receive them. They take up residence somewhere in the back of the mind, behind the daily business, quiet and persistent, and they do their work there in ways that are not always visible and not always immediate, but that are, in the long run, real. This story is going to continue in you in some way. I do not know how. I do not know what your Meridian Street looks like, or what your Route 14 is, or what your version of the frost and the guardrail might be, the accumulation that has been building somewhere in your life, in your relationships, in your health, in the conversations you have been meaning to have, in the distances you have been meaning to close, in the attention you have been meaning to pay. I do not know the specific shape of what you have been moving through too quickly to see clearly. But if you are willing to be honest with yourself in the way that honesty requires, which is not comfortable, which does not feel like relief at first, but more like the cold air outside the building when you have been inside too long. A brief unpleasantness followed by the recognition that the outside air, the real temperature, is where you actually live. You know what you have been not quite looking at. There is a version of this story's lesson that is easy and soft and does not ask very much of you. It goes, everything happens for a reason. Trust the universe. Your delays are blessings in disguise. Let go and let the cosmic plan unfold. This version is comfortable. This version requires nothing except a kind of passive receptivity, a willingness to reframe inconvenience as providence and call the reframing wisdom. I am not offering you that version. I am offering you the harder one. The one that says, you do not get to know which delays are protection and which are just delays. You do not get the view from outside your own life while you are still inside it. You do not get advance notice of the frost in the guardrail, or the morning that turns out to be a hinge, or the 4 minutes that hold the whole architecture of what comes next. You do not get any of that. What you get is the choice of how to move through the uncertainty. You get the choice of holding your irritation lightly enough that it does not wall you off from the moment you are in. You get the choice of paying attention, not to your phone, not to the performance of your own busyness, not to the managed efficiency of a life being run rather than lived, but to what is actually happening around you and inside you. In the margins, in the pauses, in the 20 minutes of cold sidewalk that feel like punishment and might be something else entirely. You get the choice of making the call today instead of Sunday, of noticing the tree, of stopping for 4 minutes when someone needs 4 minutes even when you are running late. Even when the bus is visible at the stop and the doors are still open and the math of the morning is telling you to keep moving. These choices do not guarantee anything. They do not guarantee that the delay will turn out to be protection, that the inconvenience will turn out to be a gift, that the universe will reveal itself in retrospect to have been on your side all along. They do not guarantee any particular outcome at all. What they guarantee is a different quality of presence. And presence, it turns out, is not a small thing. It is not a consolation prize for people who cannot afford certainty. It is the actual substance of a life, the material it is made of, the thing that is happening when you are not managing and not optimizing and not performing, but simply, fully, irreducibly here. I think about what Daniel said months later when someone asked him about the morning. Not a reporter, not a counselor, not anyone with a clipboard or a framework or an agenda. Just a friend at a dinner who had heard a version of the story secondhand and wanted to hear it from him. He told it simply, without drama, without the inflation that stories sometimes acquire as they travel, the way fish grow larger in the retelling, the way the near miss becomes nearer and the revelation becomes more revelatory with each iteration until the original event is barely visible beneath its own mythology. He told it the way it actually was, an alarm, a neighbor, a missed bus, a notification, a tree going gold on a block. He had walked 100 times without seeing it. And the friend said, do you think it was meant to happen? Like, do you believe in that stuff now? Daniel was quiet for a moment. The dinner table around him was warm with light and conversation and the particular ease of people who have chosen to spend an evening together and mean it. He had made something for the dinner. He had started cooking more, had discovered in it the same quality of grounded attention he had found in the 11 minutes of alley light, the same satisfaction of being present for something small and real. There was a candle on the table. Its flame moved slightly in a draft from somewhere, bending and recovering, with the patient consistency of something that knows how to maintain itself. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know if it was meant to happen. He watched the candle. But I know it happened. And I know what I almost lost without knowing I had it. And I know I'm different now. Not different like a different person, but different like more of the same person, if that makes sense. More paying attention. More actually here. He paused. I think that's enough, he said. I think not knowing is okay, as long as you don't use the not knowing as an excuse to stop paying attention. So here we are, at the end of this story that is not really an end. You have been with Daniel on the sidewalk in the cold. You have stood with him through the irritation and the wait and the notification and the discovery and the weeks of quiet recalibration that followed. You have sat with the question that has no clean answer and the honest middle ground where most of us actually live. Somewhere between the comfort of a universe that arranges things for us and the loneliness of a universe that doesn't. And now you are here, in your own life, with your own version of the alarm set wrong and the bus pulling away and the cold morning that was not what you planned. I want to leave you with the question that Daniel eventually stopped trying to answer and started trying to live. Not was it meant to happen. But what if the thing irritating me right now is holding something I cannot see yet? What if the delay is a door? What if the inconvenience is an invitation, not from the cosmos, not from providence, not from any force that requires you to believe in it before it can work, but from the part of you that already knows what you have been moving through too fast to see, that has been trying to get your attention through the only channels available, which are sometimes the channels of friction and interruption and the small, maddening ways that mornings do not cooperate? What if the pause is the point? Not always. Not with the mechanical certainty of a rule that applies in every case and transforms every frustration into hidden blessing. The world is too complicated for that, and your intelligence deserves better than that. Sometimes the delay is just a delay. Sometimes the missed bus is just a missed bus, and the day is harder for it, and there is nothing to extract from it except the experience of a day being harder than you wanted. But sometimes you are standing exactly where you need to be, furious about a bus that has already left, completely unaware that the fury is the least important thing happening to you in that moment. Sometimes the 20 minutes you resent are the 20 minutes that hold everything. Sometimes what irritates you today is what is quietly, invisibly keeping you safe. And the only way to find out, the only way to be available for the version of your life in which the delay becomes the doorway, is to be present for it. To stand in it. To resist the reflex to fill it with noise and instead let it be what it is. A pause. A breath. A moment of stillness in the middle of a city that does not stop. To look up from your phone. To notice the gargoyle. To watch the child with the stick. To let yourself be for a few minutes on a cold sidewalk. Exactly where you are, not where you intended to be. Not where you are going, but here, in this specific moment. On this specific morning, which will never come again. Which is happening right now, which is, if you are willing to see it, already more than enough. Daniel stood at the bus stop on Meridian Street on a Saturday, with no bus coming, and looked at the gargoyle on the building across the street. The gargoyle looked back. Neither of them said anything. The city breathed in. The city breathed out. Somewhere on a block 3 streets over, a tree was doing what trees do in late autumn, releasing, one by one, the last of its gold. Each leaf making its small and unhurried descent to the sidewalk below, where it would be walked on by people who were not looking and noticed by people who were. And either way would complete its particular cycle of color and falling and return, as it had done before and would do again, patient and indifferent, and if you were standing still enough to see it, unutterably beautiful. Daniel put his hands in his pockets. He was not late for anything. For the first time in a long time, he was not late for anything at all. And if what irritates you today is protecting you, would you be still enough to let it?